decades of advocacy and very, very strong and insightful assertions of human rights, which are guaranteed to everybody on the planet. Unfortunately, under Xi Jinping and his predecessors, that has not been the case. You know, I've been, as was mentioned, in Congress since 1980. When Ronald Reagan was elected, I was elected as well. And many of us had the highest hopes that communism, because it is so anti-human being, because it is so anti-human rights, would soon go to the dustbin of history. We saw it with the breakup of the Soviet Union. We saw it with the East Bloc countries. And China looked at that and said, not here, not anytime soon, and have doubled down on their repression ever since. During the Tiananmen Square massacre and the roundups and the people who were thrown into prison, our country, under successive presidents, in my opinion, have been weak, vacillating, sometimes rhetorical. They'll say something that sounds good. Bill Clinton, for example, called out George Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, and said that he had coddled dictatorship by not being forceful and strong post Tiananmen Square. I agreed with him. I'm a Republican, and said, you know, we've got to get this right. But unfortunately, Bill Clinton coddled like nobody has ever coddled ever. He linked human rights with trade in 1993. Many of us went to the floor of the House, held press conferences, and said, thank you, Mr. President, for doing so. And then 1 year later, and in the interim, I traveled to Beijing, as I had often done. I had a letter with 100 signers on it, including Speaker Pelosi, then just a member of Congress, but a very distinguished one, and presented it to the foreign ministry, and they basically laughed and said, one, it's sovereignty. You have nothing to say about it. That's what all human rights abusers do. That's what they used to say in South Africa during apartheid. That's what they used to say in the Soviet Union. All dictatorships say it's a matter of sovereignty, even though these are fundamental human rights that are universally protected by UN covenants and treaties and aspirations that come out of that body. So that was his first comment. His second was, the fix is already in. They being China, are going to get this very, very lucrative most favored nation status without any kind of linkage to human rights. We came back, contacted the White House. Warren Christopher was then the Secretary of State, and argued as passionately as I could that they think you're bluffing. Unfortunately, Bill Clinton was bluffing. On May 26, 1994, he took his executive order, which was really perfectly well written in terms of human rights benchmarks, and the operative phrase was significant progress had to be made or else most favored nation status would have been a goner, would have been gone. And you know, for an export-driven economy, that would have been catastrophic. So I believe had we stood our ground, there would have been very, very serious reforms that would have come in the wake of the loss of MFN. I have with me today the transcript. I did a press conference about an hour after Clinton did this. It was done late on a Friday afternoon after just about every House and Senate member had gone home. I was lingering, working, doing some paperwork when the news story broke. I rushed over and did a press conference on it, and it's here for your perusal. It was a complete capitulation. In my opinion, historically, that's when China took the measure of the United States and said all that they care about are profits, not human rights. Yes, rhetorically, they'll say they're for human rights, but they're not when really push comes to shove. And we've had successive presidents who, in like manner, have had the false narrative that if we just trade more, somehow this dictatorship will matriculate into a democracy. And as we've all seen, nothing could be further from the truth. Xi Jinping really is the embodiment of Mao Zedong. He espouses, he reveres him, and unfortunately pushes many of the same repressive measures, the endemic, pervasive use of torture, for example, which can be found everywhere against the religious community and against the political activists, democracy activists. Just a couple of things. I was happy when Secretary Pompeo raised the issue of religious freedom very aggressively at the two summits that were held during the summer months. That was a good move. And as the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I was very happy that China was put on Tier 3 egregious violator for labor and sex trafficking, which it is. We could not get that from the Obama administration. For the 1 year that they were on Tier 3, it was an automatic downgrade. Had nothing to do with a call, a courageous call being made by the White House and the State Department. So finally, at least that is being exposed. Now, fast forward to the Hong Kong issue. Scott Clipsey is here with us today. Back in 5 years ago, I introduced the first Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and Scott was instrumental in that legislation. It didn't pass. The same old crowd that said, oh, you will make matters worse if somehow you raise the issue of human rights in a way that is actionable. And again, this is our foreign policy now, U.S. foreign policy. We give Hong Kong very, very special. I mean, MFN is a goner. That's been gone for a lot of years. But in this case, we do give Hong Kong a tremendous number of benefits that are because it is different. You know, you look back at the solemn promises that were made by Beijing in the Sino-British 1984 statement. I went back and I reread that. It is very well written, and it commits, after the conveyance of Hong Kong back to China, it commits them, they being Beijing, to respecting fundamental human rights and having a different system, a capitalist system in Hong Kong. Then you look at the Basic Law, which reads a whole lot like the Bill of Rights for the United States. It is very well written and, again, binds the Chinese government to respecting human rights and democracy. And that, too, in these recent years now, have begun the shredding of those very solemnly undertaken promises. So what do we do? Well, under the previous administration, we did nothing. I hope that this administration will sign this bill into law and be very firm. You have to be belligerent. Just be firm. Say, you know, Xi Jinping, you promised all of this. Your government, previous, and now you're breaking that solemn oath by doing what you're doing in terms of taking the Basic Law and violating it, and it's en route to a massive violation over time. So much so that Hong Kong will be indistinguishable from any other city in mainland China. The legislation passed. It is totally bipartisan. Jim and I, as you know, he spoke earlier, he's the principal co-sponsor on my bill, and I'm the principal co-sponsor on his bill, the PROTECT Act, to ensure that U.S. corporations are not aiding and abetting the surveillance state and providing weapons, providing tear gas and everything else that is used to repress the wonderful people who have taken to the streets. We're not going to give up on this. The House has passed it. We're hoping the Senate will just put it up for a vote and pass it and send it down to the President. And I do believe when he is presented with this bill, he will sign it. And then that annual review, and it will be a quick review, start right away under Secretary Pompeo, will be to look at whether or not the Basic Law, whether or not the Sino-British Joint Declaration, whether or not the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is included in the bill, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether or not those four principles of bodies, of commitments are being violated, and if they are, to take very decisive action to say we will no longer honor a special treatment of Hong Kong if indeed you have made these changes, which they have. Right now, it's a slam dunk as to what the determination will be. Our hope is that the government of China will revisit, that other voices, perhaps other than Xi Jinping, and I think Carrie Lam is not the one calling the shots, it's coming right out of Beijing, will say enough is enough, we got to cease and desist on this. They did back off on the extradition, at least for now, and that was a warning shot across the bow of another escalation another effort to undermine fundamental freedoms and human rights in Hong Kong. You've got one big takeaway. It is totally bipartisan. Yes, some of the business interests are weighing in against this, but frankly, ever since MFN was on the table as an issue, they have weighed in and they were wrong. Again, their narrative is somehow if you just trade more and provide unbelievable largesse to the People's Republic of China, somehow they will evolve into a human rights loving government has been proven demonstrably false. The great experiment failed. So it's time to say we're not going to let that happen again to another group of people, the 8 million wonderful people of Hong Kong. Thank you.
And Sunny, do you want to accept it on his behalf?
At the end of the day, Hong Kong benefits, even China benefits from the trade. But we're going to make sure, and it's embedded in the bill, that not only will that special relationship be reappraised in an ongoing basis and ended if there's a finding that's negative, but also the Commerce Department will have to look at whether or not our export laws are being violated, particularly with the surveillance state that Xi Jinping is obsessed with. I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post that ran in December 27th of this past year, calling on world leaders to look at the synodization of all religions.
Only having the United States on our side with Hong Kong is not enough. We have to have the international community on our side as well in terms of to contain China. But we believe that the United States is definitely the one who is capable, who is able to contain China and to lead the fight for defending our freedom, core values, autonomy, democracy in terms of against the Chinese communist regime. And again, thank you very much, Congressman Smith, for introducing the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, because that is not only the act that represents a very significant process in terms of USA's legislative procedures on standing with Hong Kong, but it is also a very significant step in terms of what the world can exactly do for Hong Kong. So we believe that the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act is also symbolizing a new stage, a new era in terms of being aware and be alert of China's rise. So again, thank you very much, Congressman Smith.
Buddhists and people from Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, and concentrating on what everyone has in common is exactly the right thing to do. And I congratulate you for taking this approach. This year in Hong Kong, we have seen the power of young leaders who have taken to the streets over and over and over again to stand up for their rights. The Civil Human Rights Front is a coalition of 50 organizations that has been absolutely key in building and sustaining the Hong Kong protest movement. And its leaders are young. Many are students, including 4 of those who are with us today. And all of us have seen them in action over the last several months. I mean, the whole world has been riveted on what has been happening in Hong Kong. And the creativity of this movement is the likes of which we have never seen before. The peaceful approach, the polite approach to protest, organizing in ways that I think other protests that we have observed over the years have not necessarily followed. But one of the reasons why they're effective is because of the way they have approached this. And want to choose their own leaders. This week, this past week, the House of Representatives passed legislation in solidarity and in support of the demands of the Hong Kongers, both the Protect Hong Kong Act that I introduced, which bans exports of equipment used to repress protesters, and the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, passed by a unanimous vote in the House of Representatives. Democrats and Republicans all came together. Liberals and conservatives all came together. For those of you who have been observing Washington in the last few months, we can't agree on what to have for lunch. And yet people came together in solidarity behind these measures. Now it's time to pressure the Senate to do its part and to push the Trump administration to do the right thing. And so far they haven't. You know, we have heard some very positive statements from some individuals in the Trump administration on some of the expressing solidarity with the protesters, but we haven't heard it from the president. And until the president gets, you know, on the right track here and joins with the bipartisan coalition in the Congress, we are sending mixed messages to mainland China. We need to make it clear, and by that I mean our entire government, from Congress to the executive branch, that if the United States of America stands for anything, we stand out loud and four square for human rights. And while we're gathering here, the news from Xinjiang is terrible, and the repression in Tibet continues.
Please come.
Center. They forgot about our side.
I think it's good. We need to move on.
Cool.
The real heroes, therefore, are all the Hong Kongers who relentlessly took to the streets with such courage and determination that amazed and inspired the world. Despite facing a greater and greater danger, consequences, and even persecution every single day. This prize and recognition are for them. May all the glory be to Hong Kong. In Cantonese, 願榮光歸香港.
My name is John. I come from Democracy China. I have my YouTube. Every time I will show my program to people in mainland China. We know that the problems in Hong Kong were caused by the Communist Party of China. So when I show my programs to people in mainland China, some people suggest to me, why not demand turn down Communist Party of China directly? As we know, you have 5 demands. Yes, of course, it's right. But the people in mainland China, they want to add another one, to turn down Communist Party of China. That's the most important. So why people in Hong Kong don't want to demand to turn down Communist Party of China?
You mean overthrow the Communist Party?
Well, I believe something that Hong Kong protesters has realized is about the regime that we are facing, that we are confronting, is no longer the Hong Kong government, but instead the Chinese government and the Chinese communist regime. And I believe that it is some of the Hong Kong protesters' goal, or other people who are suffering from the rule of the communist regime's goal, that their wish is to turn down the Chinese communist regime. However, the reason why we are striving for or asking for our 5 demands is because that is the actual situation in Hong Kong, and that is something that Hong Kong protesters had to solve, that had to bring it to a resolution in a short time. So that's why Hong Kong protesters had been asking for the 5 demands. And I believe turning down the Chinese communist regime is not something that you can achieve in few days or in few months or in the near future. We have to achieve it step by step. So that's why we have to fight for freedom, democracy, democracy inside Hong Kong first, and other countries or other nations or other places that are suffering from the Chinese communist regime. So I believe that might be a goal for a long term, but in short, we are trying to defend our core values. We're trying to defend our universally shared values first in the short term. So yes, so that I believe that's why people in Hong Kong are strengthening for the 5 demands instead of the one that some of the Chinese citizens are calling for. And I appreciate your courage for bringing the truth, for bringing the history in Hong Kong or other places into mainland China. And I believe that is also very important because the Chinese communist regime had been trying to brainwash Chinese citizens by spreading fake history, fake information. And I believe it is very important for us to bring in real information, real history for Chinese citizens so that they can know what is actually happening, what the Chinese communist regime had been doing for a very long time in the history. And thank you very much for doing that.
Well, I would like to second Joey that it's very courageous of you to do this, to show the truth to mainland Chinese, and I understand that by doing so in China is actually very dangerous. So I thank you for speaking out for the truth and spreading the truth to all the Chinese. And I also believe that in Hong Kong, because we all we all understand that in Hong Kong, we are the only place in the whole China who still have some freedom, who still have a system, although the system is being attacked, but we still are trying to preserve the system that can protect us, protect the human rights that we have. And I also believe that by preserving Hong Kong as who we are, by preserving our system, we can be an inspiration and also be a good influence to mainland China. And because, well, what you have suggested is very ambitious, and Hong Kong people, although we are very concerned about the political situation in China, but Hong Kong people cannot do it for the whole China. Chinese people have to do it for yourself. We're concerned about it. Every year we memorize what happened 30 years ago in Tiananmen, memorize the Tiananmen massacre. So we're concerned about it, but nobody can do it for China. Chinese have to stand up and fight for it for yourselves. So I would like to ask all the people to join in solidarity to fight for the values that we all uphold and fight for a better future, fight for a better world together.
知识储备啊，比较。
你们最近没有文章？
有特别多的活动。
啊，这个唱歌的还蛮好的。
Originally, the architect thought this was going to be a great American symbol. Everyone was going to totally love it. It was going to get 1 million likes on Facebook and Instagram. But it turns out everyone hated the design, and so no one ever copied it. Supreme Court chamber. Chamber for 50. We are directly under the Capitol Rotunda and the Capitol Dome. It was originally meant to be a resting place for our first president, George Washington. He was supposed to be buried under that white star in the center. He said, guys, that's a little weird. I'd rather just be buried at the White House. And that's what happened. But we'll leave the door open just in case George decides he wants to take a trip. Part It almost looks like ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And that is because when they created this country, its founders envisioned George Washington rising up into heaven, and to continue the Greek and Roman theme, various aspects of the American identity, wisdom, agriculture, economy, are represented by various Greek gods. Not very humble, I have to say. Parts of American history are depicted running along the edge here. It was actually very dangerous painting to complete. The original painter fell off the scaffolding and had to hold on for 20 minutes until he could come to his rescue. But it starts with arriving. There's many images from the colonial period and the native people that the settlers encountered. There are scenes of war, of tree-making, all the way through the Revolutionary War, where the man on the rearing horse depicts the Battle of Lexington. Next to the Battle of Yorktown, where the British surrendered to the American forces. And it goes all the way to when the Wright brothers launched the first plane in Kitty Hawk. At that point, we ran out of room. History didn't stop, of course, as you can tell by the many statues around you. Presidents such as Abraham Lincoln or Ronald Reagan. And the statue of Ronald Reagan actually has little pieces of the Berlin Wall inside of it. We've got 8 paintings on the wall around us. 4 of them are sort of more conquest paintings, which some people do feel a little questionable about, because not all of history is very wonderful. This depicts, one of the rainbow depicts hope that people had leaving their old country and coming to the new. You can see on the right, very faintly the outline of an old English castle, and on the left, a rainbow with hope for the pilgrims coming to America. We also see several paintings winning battles. You'll see a white circle in the center of the floor. That is directly above the white star we passed to the crypt below. You can almost, if you're standing directly above the crypt, you can almost imagine the statues and the Magna Carta and the white star below us. When the president dies or an important official, they are often put here until lying in state. Their coffin is here, surrounded by members of the armed services, and the public can pay their respects. Most recently, I believe, was one of the later statues. These are actually here in case a member of Congress or their staff really need to get somewhere. It's a Statue of Liberty, giving the Constitution. Like I said, she's of course surrounded by an eagle, a perpetual symbol of the United States, and also of the old Roman Republic, which a lot of the architecture in this room and the Capitol seeks to emulate. I don't know how long on the floor, you will see certain bronze plaques. All the guys, if they really wanted to, and have a nice place to relax. I think that's nice. The most recent addition to this hall is a statue of Chief Standing Bear. And he is immortalized here in a statue from Nebraska because of the work he did to secure rights for the native peoples. He argued in this very room. And earlier this year, we finally put up a statue to honor that struggle. We also have, and some of the statues generated some controversy, this one among them, a statue of Jefferson Davis. He was the leader of the Confederacy, the part of the United States that tried to break off from their own country during the Civil War. He was actually a member and tolerate other people's opinions that you don't like. You have the right to say, I don't even want all opinions. There are other people who you might not like have the right to say it too, but it's something we try and respect. They could change that at any time, but they don't. Unfortunately, the old Senate chamber is closed today, but I do have a story about that I want to tell you. So, though we cannot see the chamber, I want you to imagine a dark room, velvet red curtains, mahogany desks, a bunch of senators sitting shoulder to shoulder. They were stuck in there as long as they could, and finally when we got too many states, they moved into their current room because it was just too crowded. Like the old Supreme Court room, the old Senate chamber was definitely a place of contention, especially leading up to the Civil War. Because you had senators from free states in the north and senators from slaveholding states in the south sitting right next to each other, writing bills right next to each other, public ballot together. So we toned that down. But a senator named Sumner was a who wanted to fight. So originally he was going to challenge him to a duel with pistols, like gentlemen. But his friend, when he eventually made it back to the old Senate, he kept right on talking about how everyone should be free. So I like to think of that as an inspiring example. As you can see, we've had drama, both the House and the Senate. Who was beaten, Senator Sumner, are now both heroes to their respective supporters. So unfortunately, he was reelected. But luckily, not too many people know about him today. That's why I didn't want to mention his name. I'm sure you're all hungry. You had a long meeting this morning. We're going to take you to the Longworth cafeteria. When we get back to the visitor center, I'm going to need to collect your headsets. So before you go, unfortunately, you cannot keep those. Be nice.
Unfortunately, it was so kind of.
Yours doesn't really work anyway.
So I can take it right.
No. He was a very important advocate for civil rights for Native Americans. So I think we're trying to just think about that. Because also
结束了吗？王会游完结束就完了是吧？下午你们再搞。对。哦，培训。哦。明白。嗯。拍的还是比较爱好的，然后你还可以专门说个人民币的这是搞2天也不容易。马马虎虎，我就是。
账号给你封解封了。
解封了。1个月。
老师没事儿好像。老师没关系，从你们。
现在没有。学校没设好，对啊，这个是现在就还行。我昨天晚上回去，我们跑了3个点。
just leave you guys someplace to eat lunch.